Hi, my name is Robert Grillo, and I'm the founder of Slaughter-Free Network and Free from Harm. And today I'm presenting The Walrus and the Whirlwind, in search of the transformative turning point in animal rights. I created this presentation because I, like many of you out there, have often questioned why we haven't seen a turning point in our movement. What does it look like? And why haven't we seen it sooner? What elements or conditions must be in place for that to happen? And I feel like in the last several years I've learned a lot about how social movements work. And I thought that this presentation could present the insights that I've come across as to what I think it takes to see a turning point. And then also ideas for how we can bring about that turning point. Because I think we tend to see this as something that will happen independent of our own work, but actually it's all about us making it happen and taking control, taking charge of the situation to make it happen. So the first part of this presentation is going to look at the big picture and movement ecology in the animal rights and vegan movement, looking at the key players, the different organizations, and their theories of change. Now, everyone has a theory of change, whether they recognize it as such or not. A theory of change is simply the modus operandi, the reason, the beliefs that we have that drives our work we do in this movement. Everybody's got different ways of approaching that. So it's important that we understand those different theories of change. The second part is going to look at Slaughter-Free Network's theory of change and how it informs our activism. That is, how it informs our day-to-day campaigning work. So lastly, we'll take a look at the steps that I believe that we must take to create this whirlwind for the walrus, or in other words, this big turning point that we really want to see in our movement. So, looking at the big picture for a moment. This is critical, I think, because it gives us a more in-depth and holistic perspective, not just on our own movement and how it's functioning and how it can succeed, but on understanding social movements more universally. We have so much to learn from understanding other social movements, and when we zoom out, we can see things more clearly. We start seeing patterns for success that we can actually use. So I felt very compelled to do the presentation because I feel that our movement is sorely lacking this much needed big picture perspective, which I think is also preventing us from realizing our full potential. So let's talk a moment about movement ecology, which is really nothing more than, well, it's a lot of things, but for the purpose of this presentation, it's really about understanding the intricate parts of our movements and how they depend on each other, and how there's a potential for greater solidarity that could bring us closer to our shared vision, as well as deepen our sense of community, which is so important to so many of us. Without sociability and community, we feel estranged, and rightfully so. So community is very important to inspire us and keep us moving forward. And in this section, I'll talk about a few points. The first is a diversity of strategies, tactics, roles, and as well as timing. So we'll be talking about Bill Moyer's 8 stages of a social movement. So we often hear, on this note, we often hear people saying, well, everyone's role is needed. All these different approaches are needed for a movement to succeed. They all play a part. And I agree with that statement 100%. However, what Bill Moyers shows us is that it's not just about all the roles being needed, but it's the timing of when they're needed that is very important. So for example, he says in the early stages of a social movement, the more radical flank is very much needed to get the issue in a broad public sphere where lots of people are talking about it and it's getting media coverage, and we're creating some momentum from that. And then in the later stages, when we really have succeeded in building majority public support, then the legislators and the attorneys and the lobbyists are very much needed in those later stages. So we'll get into that a little bit. I also want to talk about movement dynamics in the animal rights vegan movement, and I have come up with this kind of random, well, it's not random, but it's not based on data. This idea that 90% of our movement is a reformist and moderate in its approach, and about 10% is radical or transformative. And the reason I come up with this 90-10 is because if we look at all of the major groups, such as like the Humane League, Mercy for Animals, Humane Society of the United States, Animal Equality, Pro-Veg International, Animal Charity Evaluators, Faunalytics, etc. All of these groups and people working for them are working in a moderate reformist space, for the most part. On the other hand, there's some groups and individuals that are seeking transformational change to our food system or to advancing animal liberation. So we'll be looking at that. And is a 90-10 ratio really a recipe for success, for accelerated change, or not? I will argue that it's not, and that we need a better balance. That comes later. And then I also want to look at the role, the much overlooked and misunderstood role of the radical flank in the movement. And then finally, back to that moment of the whirlwind idea, which is part of the title of this presentation. And the moment of the whirlwind is a big trigger moment, a big turning point where public support and sympathies just seem to explode. And one recent example that we could find is George Floyd in the racial justice movement. The George Floyd incident, murder, galvanized an enormous amount of public support that was otherwise latent. And so these moments of the whirlwind and identifying them and using them to advance the movement is critical for ourselves as well. So let's look at this 8 Stages of a Social Movement by Bill Moyers, who was an activist that was working very well known in the civil rights and anti-war movement in the 70s. We could do a whole presentation on this 8 Stages of a Social Movement, but for the sake of this presentation, we will just focus on a few important takeaways. First, the general trend in phases 1 through 6 is about expanding public support. So 1 is business as usual, meaning things haven't changed much. The injustice that we are trying to fight against is still status quo. No one really questions it. Number 2, stage 2 is normal. Normal channels fail. In other words, the movement tries using diplomacy and all these different tactics and strategies to try to get the attention of the public and power holders, and it doesn't work too well. They just laugh us off, right? But in stage 4, something real interesting happens, and this is a stage of the whirlwind where public support becomes very heightened. And it's because of a whirlwind event, a trigger event, like George Floyd. And then that's followed by a kind of crash in stage 5, where it looks like it's over, and most of the activists actually leave the movement thinking that it's done and it's failed. But then in stage 6, all of a sudden we see look at public support and how it goes up and how organizers go up. And all of a sudden there's all this momentum again. And then in stage 7 is where we achieve a major victory. Like when the Supreme Court decided that gay marriage was the law of the land. Stage 7 is really when the lobbyists and attorneys and legislators and politicians need to step up because we have the public support now. We can make the change that we wanted official. We can codify it into law and legislation. And then stage 8 is ensuring that that win, that victory does not get undone, because it can happen, right? We've seen it happen, for example, with the Roe versus Wade decision being overturned recently. So where are we then in the animal rights vegan movement in terms of this 8 stages model? Well, I would put us at about a stage 2 or 3. We're still not being taken seriously to the extent that we should. However, in that stage 2, however, conditions are ripening, which is stage 3. There's something brewing. There's a storm brewing. And society can sense this. There's anxiety. There's tension. There's a conflict brewing. And that's what we need. We need to create a moral crisis to capture the public and media attention on this issue. Okay, so now let's take a moment to look at what's called the radical flank effect. And first, let's qualify what we mean when we use the word radical, because the word has been stigmatized and misused, and even suggestive of violent acts. We often hear that radicals give a movement a bad name. But it's important for us to recognize that many great leaders of the past were considered radicals, and they were disliked intensely in their own contemporary times. So we're talking about Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and the suffragettes. There's many examples we could give of great people that we revere today as incredible social change makers that at the time were very, very much disliked and considered or dismissed as radical. And the interesting thing is that studies like this one, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, shows that perhaps we should be actually thanking the radical flank instead of scorning them and blaming them for our lackluster results, for the fact that only about 2 or 3% of the population is vegan. Is it their fault because they've given us a bad name? Or is it does the moderate have to really have to think about their approaches? Because, hey, they're steering the ship, right? If they're 90% of our movement, then they're largely responsible for the results that or the conditions that we currently find ourselves in, which is not very, very advanced, right? So we can look at studies like this, but we can also look at real-world experience and see that the radical flank has a way of accelerating public attention and support, which then later benefits the moderate side, because the public perceives the radical demands as unreasonable, and then the moderates present their demands and their message, and it looks and sounds a lot more reasonable. So for example, it could explain why today animal welfare measures are so immensely popular. And most of society supports animal welfare measures. However, they don't support animal liberation, which is perhaps the radical position. But if it wasn't for the presence of the radical position in the minds of the public, they would very likely not think that animal welfare reform was a very reasonable idea either. So the radical flank can increase support for the moderate position of various movements, and that's the big takeaway here. And many movements have gained traction through radical grassroots beginnings, including the civil rights movement, suffragettes, Black Lives Matter, ACT UP, in the 80s in New York City, fighting for the lives of patients with AIDS and people with AIDS. Also, the anti-war factions of the anti-war and environmental movements have been have had very important radical flanks. The fact is that there's just a lot to do here. There's one other point before we go to the next slide. One other really important point, I think, and that is that moderates take a more rationalist approach to their messaging, and so they stress facts and figures, and they make rational, very good sound rational arguments. They present themselves as being experts in the field and being professionals. In other words, dressing and acting the role of the professional in society. Whereas the radical side says, the radical rejects what Extinction Rebellion founder Roger Hallam will call, quote, the professionalization of the public space. And what he means is that that we've stifled creativity and the ability to kind of come up with creative ways of responding and kind of taking control of the discourse. And we can use emotion and symbolism instead of facts and figures because they actually appeal to a much broader audience. And so the radical side rejects this whole rationalist approach and says most people will be much more moved by the emotional and symbolic nature of our message. Okay, so then moving on, this is the last slide in this section. So to continue, the moderate side is going to be stressing more what they think is more practical and realistic. They might have lower expectations about changes happening, and they have probably a more limited view of the public's ability or capacity to change. Whereas the radical side stresses vision and truth and urgency, the climate crisis, having an urgent response to that, for example. And they have a more expansive view, I think, of the public, and that the opportunities to change public hearts and minds is far greater than the moderates give it credit. And as far as demands go, the moderate flank does not typically impose major costs to targets for not meeting a demand. And their demands are often focused on a symptom rather than a cause. So they might be, instead of looking at people's beliefs or trying to change hearts and minds, they're actually looking at cellular meat or other dietary or market factors or consumer factors that they believe could create a revolution in the shift to a plant-based food system. Whereas the demands on the radical side target the root causes of the injustice or the problem. They tend to be bolder, more high stakes, and more long-term. So animal liberation, a plant-based food system by a certain year, those kind of things. The moderate side is more focused on consumers and end users and believes that consumers have a lot of control over their own destiny. And this expression, voting with your dollars, comes up a lot in these spaces. Whereas the radical flank says, nope, the focus needs to be on the power holders of our food system because they make the big decisions about what's going to be available to consumers. And they do this behind closed doors and without our input. So to make this system more transparent and more democratic and more consumer participating, having people participate in it more, then we need to be focusing on the elites at the top of this food system. The moderates often stress market-level solutions, like I said, cellular meat, plant-based technologies, or plant-based forms of agriculture that are new and exciting. Whereas the radical flank says the focus needs to be at this, especially at this point in our movement, on ideological change, changing hearts and minds, because beliefs drive behavior. That's a big part of the radical position. Beliefs drive behavior. On the moderate side, you'll often hear that we need to meet people where they are. And so the radical response to that is, yeah, we need to meet them where they are and then take them somewhere else because their heads are in the wrong, they're stuck in the wrong space. They need their minds need to be disrupted, like corporate advertising actually does. We need to find creative ways to disrupt people's normal thought process and not just, settle for meeting them where they are. On the moderate side, there's a big emphasis on one-on-one personal transformation. We see a lot of people working with other individuals to try to help them make this personal vegan transformation. However, on the radical side, people will say, well, you can do that from now until doomsday, and we can have millions of people out there trying to do this, but it's never going to be enough, in that we really need to be focusing on dominant institution change, because again, the power holders of our food system that head up these dominant institutions are the ones calling the shots and deciding the fate of billions of animals, as well as the choices, the food choices of millions, potentially billions of humans. And then lastly, as far as examples of campaigns that are moderate, we have things like Meatless Mondays. We have the program known as carbon offset credits, where corporate polluters get to pollute as long as they kind of figure out a way to buy credits here and then pollute there. So it's not really a recipe for really mitigating the climate crisis. And another example would be like Obamacare, which is a program that requires people to have insurance, of course, but then also makes a lot of money for the insurance industry, versus single-payer health care, for example, which would be probably considered a more radical position, where, at least here, in the rest of the world it's not, but in the United States it's considered a position that would be more on the transformational radical side. And then examples of radical flank movements that succeeded quite well would be like civil rights movement, the suffragettes, Black Lives Matter, ACT UP, we talked about these before, and then I would add to that the South African apartheid, the anti-apartheid movement there. And so that's it for movement ecology. And the next section, we're going to be moving to the slaughter-free network theory of change. Thank you so much.